But I want to go back to your he runs product, he runs technology, he leads a team of exceptionally talented engineers. And who's kidding who? I don't care what the structure is at Meta, but who wouldn't want Elon Musk sitting by their side running product?
I see a show of hands.
There may be a few show of hands to get the cute chuckles you're getting, but I would say the percentages in this room are about 99% who would say no to that and 1% of maybe personal opinion or
So
feelings.
in
Yes, folks, that is one of the titans of industry, one of the chief executives of. Whoops.
But I want to go back to
Well, we
your
don't need to see you again, Yacarino, of major communications platform X, formerly known as Twitter. I would recommend people watch that entire thing. I don't know. Have you seen Linda Yacarino? So
Not yet.
she's the CEO of Twitter, and she was surprised because a former Twitter employee that's been very critical of Elon Musk, Yoel Roth, was at that conference in a sort of surprise announcement an hour beforehand. And I would just say, you don't even need to watch the full thing. Watch the first 8 minutes and you see how somebody who is compensated beyond any of our wildest dreams, somebody who just millions of dollars, the stock is just, this is the type of person. And then you see how absolutely worthless they are. How just no thought, no capability to do a basic sort of reaction. I think the in-person debate medium of YouTube is maybe overrated, but you got to have a little bit of composure if you're going to say, yeah, I'm making more than 200 employees combined. You're going to need to be able to handle that stuff a little bit better. But anyways, that's Linda Yacarino. David, welcome. It is another Tuesday.
Yeah, happy to be here. We got a big episode for everyone today. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Alice Speri, an incredible journalist who's put together a really important piece on the nightmare in Ukraine, both of brutal violence against people, and also the unfortunate human consequences of this collaboration law in Ukraine. Really important piece. So that will be coming up in just a little bit. And there's also a link below if people want to read the full thing later. Just a programming warning too, that we are going to talk about some pretty brutal stuff, including sexual violence during that conversation. So just be forewarned.
Yep.
But before we get to all of that, on the no less dark and evil. Sorry, unless you.
Well, we should just acknowledge Robbie H is sort of in very I think he's getting this 5G signal stuck with mine. Law solidarity with Matt not caring about the McCarthy vote. So yeah, Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy is out. I believe Nancy Mace is one of the people who was surprisingly didn't support him. I'll be honest, I don't know much about the upshots of this. I as on a personal level, McCarthy's always been very funny to me because, speaking of Yacarino and having trouble speaking, Kevin McCarthy is bad at talking, and not just picking the words, but enunciating them in the correct order that they should be spoken. And I don't know, I don't know what this means for the GOP, but it's not, I don't think, an impressive show.
I mean, it's a pure chaos party, right?
Right.
It's a pure chaos party, and we might have a little bit more on that, I think, coming up in the post game. But yeah, I mean, another day of wild and insane news coming out of the grand old party.
And the new guy, Patrick McHenry, is a bow tie guy. And
Nice.
he hits the gavel really hard, so you can look up that on your own time.
I'd be doing that too. I'll give him a little credit there. I'd be smacking that thing around if I had it.
Busting it off, going through gavels like it's baseball bats that you crack.
Oh man. Well, let's get to this other story of Republican disarray, Matt.
Okay.
Because as the Congress is going through their bit here in Texas, our GOP, the party that is firmly in control of the state, continues not just in its brutality against people, but it's a real like chaotic moment. I mean, there are some real divisions within the party, as people know. Ken Paxton ended up getting out of impeachment, but it shows some real divisions within the party. So there's a lot of clamoring right now and attempts to find things that bring all of these folks together. And one thing that brings Republicans together, despite all their differences, is hating on migrants. So let's go into this story a little bit because it is really bizarre, but there's some pretty sinister underlying aspects to this. So this is a tweet that came out from Brandon Waltons, who's with the Texas Scorecard, and a lot of y'all might not be familiar with them. These are the folks. It's a lobby group, effectively, to try to get the Republican Party to be even more far right than they are. These are the geniuses behind the movie The Texas Heist, which we played a little bit of a couple weeks back.
Okay.
Basically argued that the Texas Republican Party had been infiltrated and taken over by the Democratic Party. Really beautiful, big minds over there. And this, he tweeted this out, and I think a lot of people were confused by it. So if you're listening,
Yes.
this
I'll narrate it because I was completely I was one of the people completely confused by this. He says, Brandon Walton says, "What country do you think I'm in right now? This is Colony Ridge, and it's right here in Texas." And I look at it, and I'm like, seems about right. Yeah.
yeah, it looks like Texas, don't it?
I mean, it's yeah. I've been to Dallas. Yeah, that seems like Texas.
So this is a pretty amazing story. I mean, one, I think that like the first reaction is right. It's like, yeah, that looks very much like a lot of parts of the state. So what is it that they're getting so worked up about?
Like, are you playing geolocator? What's that game where you have to geoguessr?
Where that dude is like, yeah, I can find out exactly where you pissed or something. Yeah, no, these so this is the new fixation of the Republican Party, and it's a development called Colony Ridge, which is near Houston, Texas. And if you look closely, you'll notice that this not being a very unique photograph of a house in the state of Texas, becomes very clear very quickly what they're talking about. What they're upset about is the fact that there's a Mexican flag flying in the backyard of one of these homes, and there's a little Mexican flag decal on the mailbox on one of the other homes. So, what is Colony Ridge? Why are they all getting super worked up about it? Well, maybe to get us started, we can go over to our good friends at Fox News, who, along with the Daily Wire, have been really pushing the story of some sinister stuff happening right here in the great state of Texas. So we'll just play a couple minutes of this and break it down for y'all.
Past Texas, and officials warn they could be headed here. That's Colony Ridge. It may seem like a small Texas settlement, but its rapid growth is described as a magnet for migrants. The community allows buyers to purchase land without credit or proof of income, and experts warn it invites cartel activity. And you can see it here. It's just north of Houston. Here to discuss is National Security Fellow at the Center for Immigration Study, Todd Benjamin. Todd, thanks so much for joining the program.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So I'm from Texas. I first heard it after some criminal activity that took place at one point. Texas is not a sanctuary city. How is this allowed to happen?
Well, there's a business model underway in Old East Texas where a developer has figured out a way to market in Spanish language the sale of property, quarter-acre lots, three-quarter-acre lots, to people directly from owner to borrower. So for $100 or a few $100, pretty much anybody can come in, not have to show, proof of a history of income or a credit rating or anything. They're going to pay a lot of interest, way above.
So just saying here, like, because we're going to get into the sinister stuff in a second, but I want to note one thread that we're going to get in a lot of the right wing reporting here, right? And we'll get into what Colony Ridge is and who's living there in just a second. But sometimes you can watch these things. It's like, oh man, is the right actually worried about like kind of predatory lending practices and
I was
the
gonna say, this
interest of
sounds like a
people?
free market paradise they're building here.
So they keep on sliding all this kind of stuff in, which is, hey, if the concern is like, I hope that people aren't getting screwed over and paying too much in interest to property
It's
developers, and
just
yeah,
strange
like this is a big
bedfellows,
issue.
yeah.
I think that we really should be making a bigger a deal about this, but of course, that is not what it is that they're worked up about. So let's let them continue.
Market 9%, 10%, even more, depending on the length of the loan, and then you build your own house out there. You hook up, they provide utilities and whatnot, and you hook it up and eventually build whatever you want on there.
Yeah, it's truly unbelievable. I want to bring you to the migrant encounters because, I mean, there's no way this is not a migrant. If you look at it, it's up 26.9%. Tell me, who is this developer and why is he not on the radar of Texas officials?
Well, it's the Harris family. Trey Harris, Tarano's Houston is the developer. This has kind of been going on under the radar for 10 years now. The sale and expansion and growth of this community has really been remarkable. It is probably thousands and thousands of acres under development right now. They're definitely very bullish on the market.
Oh, you're
Okay,
muted.
so
Can I just, before you go,
yes,
David,
please,
like, just
please.
the Center for Immigration Studies is a right-wing, dark money funded, Scafey, a whole bunch of the usual
Mhm.
suspects of billionaire freaks. Back in 2013, when there was a effort towards immigration reform, what's his name? Mark Krikorian appeared in Congress to testify, claiming that virtually all illegal aliens are guilty of multiple felonies. Like, this is a really right wing organization. It's pretty disgusting. Like, American discourse is so hospitable to these think tanks that are basically like
Mhm.
white nationalist front organizations.
No, I mean 100%, and we'll get a little bit more into the Center for Immigration Studies in just a moment here. But I think there's two things that are notable. A lot of these claims that you're getting are coming from that Todd fellow. A lot of these things, because so basically, what is Colony Ridge? Colony Ridge is a development community that has been developing pretty rapidly over the past decade. And again, going back to like we were talking about like the topography and the way that these houses looked in Texas. Massive growth in real estate and in property development is going on all over the state. If you spend any time driving around this state, you will see that there are massive subdivisions being developed because there are massive influxes of people coming to the state, not illegal, not just like people coming over the border, but people from all across the country are coming to the state of Texas. You can't drive for 10 minutes down 35 or any of the major highways here without seeing major developments, and that's also happening in rural areas in the state. So this whole idea is like, oh my lord, there's a population increase in this area. Something sinister or cynical must be going on here. It's just ludicrous. But if it was just, this is an interesting and dark story for a few reasons. One, because it is such a non-story, frankly. But two, like what they're really getting at here is a straight up attack on Hispanic Texans. And what's scary about this community, what is being implied here, is that dangerous people are coming into the community, taking over the state of Texas, which is just straight up factually untrue. Um, and two, again, what's the crime here is that people who are non-white are owning property in the state of Texas is the other kind of implicit worry. Reminder for those folks and everyone listening to this too, that Texas is a majority minority state. So when you are talking about the vast majority of the population of the state of Texas, you're talking about non-white people. So it was just sort of ludicrous.
How did all those Mexicans get into Texas? That's very
No idea.
suspicious.
No idea here. So anyways, we'll have some more conversations about Todd and some of these attacks on these folks in a second, unless you had something you want to add, Matt.
I do just have one more thing to add. There's a movie coming out by Martin Scorsese, Killers of the Flower Moon.
Can't wait for it.
Which, I mean, I haven't read the book yet. Honestly, I do own a copy of it, and I've heard good things about it. I'm excited to see the film as well. My basic understanding of the gist of it is that some Native Americans, I believe Cherokee, in Oklahoma, were given
Osage. Yeah.
Osage. You're right, Osage. Yeah, exactly, Osage. Were given mineral rights for oil, and then that wasn't accepted in this country,
Yeah.
and that was so like seems to a little bit ring a bell or echo or rhyme a little bit with history of what Scorsese is directing right now.
So totally. So this is just like it's a truly great example for people who don't follow Texas politics frequently to know how just insane politics in the state are. Remember, by the way, that this is a state that does have massive amounts of poverty, right? So again, if there's if there's a focus on like, hey, you know what? There's a lot of shady developers out here who are screwing over folks, and they're not giving them good services. Like that would be a nice thing for these folks to do, and it's really
Mhm.
cynical, frankly, to hear all these people talk about that, as we're going to get into with some of our elected officials in just a second. Um, when again, the focus is not, hey, you know what? We need to make sure that communities are getting adequate protection, adequate access to water and electricity and public safety. In the state of Texas, that'd be a nice thing if we were seeing these folks get into it. But again, it's all
Yeah.
this kind of fear mongering about the border. So this talk about, by the way, that the elected officials aren't, following up on this is wrong. And we'll get into some of the responses in a second. But remember, this is a non-controversy that started with the Daily Wire report, is picked up by Fox News, and then the entire right-wing media ecosystem, to sort of make this the scary threat of the day. And what is
Right.
frustrating is in a state that still has failed to deal with things like our electric grid, which killed hundreds of people during Winter Storm Uri. All of these other problems in this state, just sort of sitting by the wayside for years now. We're seeing this incredible movement from some of our elected officials here. First up, we have a special report from none other than our little governor here in Texas, Dan Patrick, the fastest growing community in Texas. And Dan Patrick goes down to Colony Ridge wearing his cute little outfit, taking a helicopter ride.
Bro,
And
come on.
and like straight up, y'all, if you like fly into Austin, for example, like this is what you will see when you fly it over Austin, not Colony Ridge, but like these kind of new developments. Again, because Texas is a state with massive growing populations. So to try to turn this into something sinister is just truly amazing to me. So we have these photographs and talks about the increased population. Again, this is something happening all across the state. Would be a nice thing if the Republican Party here was interested in education and fully funding our schools so that we could deal with the influx of human beings coming into the state from all over the country. But that doesn't seem to be high up in their priorities. So Dan Patrick's playing the game. Greg Abbott said in an interview with Dana Lash, I think, that he's going to include this in a special session called probably in October or November. And none other than Ken Paxton, our illustrious Attorney General, who, again, very recently was under trial for gross negligence and abuse of office, and is now facing multiple legal proceedings against them, has made sure that not only is he going to get involved in this, but this is actually a priority for him now that he has been reinstated as Attorney General. So let's hear him for a second.
A news story surfaced out of the Northeast Houston, a place called Colony Ridge, which on social media is referred to as Terranos Houston.
Bullshit.
It has been claimed that this is the largest planned community for illegal migrants in America. Journalists have claimed that there's a connection between the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa investing there. I don't know if any of that's true, Ken. We just read reports online. It sounds
not
surreal.
true.
It's very peculiar. I'm curious what your thoughts are on it and if your office has looked into this at all.
So when I got back, that was one of the first topics that we started discussing. As far as I know, right now, there's not a lot of legal options for this for us in my office. I think that can be corrected. I think that could be corrected by the legislature. They could provide options to address it because right now it's a private property issue, and there's no real legal angle that we found, at least in my first week back, to go to stop it. The legislature could address it. They could address it in regular session. They could potentially address it in a special session, assuming one gets called and that gets put on the call. So I'm hopeful that there's going to be some type of legislative solution that gives us some type of enforcement power to do something about it.
Okay. So Ken Paxton said something very true there, by the way, which again shows you how cynical these elected officials are. They can't do anything about somebody selling property in the state of Texas, right? Because these are people buying property legally. You're allowed to buy property. You do not have to be a citizen of the United States of America to buy property. In fact, people all across the world buy property in the state of Texas. I mean, this has been a little bit of a bugbear of the Republican Party in Texas recently. There was an attempt in the most recent legislative session to prevent Chinese people from owning property in the state of Texas. Again, this is something that is illegal and has been shown time and time again that it is illegal for a state to deny the ability to buy property without, proving like very, very, very serious high standard levels of like national security concerns. So yeah, there's nothing that the Attorney General's office can do. And if the legislature were to pass a law trying to prevent people from buying property in the state of Texas, they wouldn't be allowed to either. And again, we got to be careful here too. Let's not let the implication get, replace the truth here. The allegation that the vast majority of people living in this community are not citizens of the United States of America is not founded. Right. And so all of this is made by implication as to who is living in this community as to their legal status.
This is absolutely this is hysterical. Like literally not in a haha way, but in the witch hunt kind of way. I just finished reading Racecraft and the comparison between believing in witches and believing in race. And so maybe that's why my brain, but like to hear them say like, oh, well, we actually to move on from this is a panic about to like, oh, well, there's something I can't really do it constitutionally, but maybe the legislature can do something. It's just crazy to move on and take like the absolute a premise that is hysteria driven and move into the second realm of like, how do we legislate this?
No, I mean it's absurd. But again, Greg Abbott has implied that he is going to include this in his next special session that he's very likely to call this fall to try to privatize our school system in the state, to take money out of the public system to fund charter schools. But we got more to get to here. Let's just look at some of the facts really fast, and then we can talk about more broadly. What is Colony Ridge and what's going on here? This is from Texas Tribune, Patrick Savetic and Uriel J. Garcia. Houston area development has become a right-wing lightning rod on immigration. Colony Ridge, a massive residential development north of Houston, has quickly taken center stage in Texas politics. After weeks of report in conservative media portraying the developments as a, quote, magnet for illegal immigrants, followed by state Republican leaders expressing alarm, Governor Greg Abbott has promised that Colony Ridge will be addressed in an upcoming special legislative session, saying serious concerns have been raised. We're trying to put together as much information as possible so that I can add it to the special session, any issue that needs to be enforced in terms of a new law in the state of Texas to make sure that we're not going to have colonies like this in our state, Greg Abbott said in a radio interview. The upcoming special session is expected to start in mid-October. Harris, the developer, is a prominent Republican donor. Pretty interesting here. Particularly to the governor. He has given over $1 million to Abbott's campaign and has also contributed to local politicians such as Brandon Creighton and William Metcalf, both of Conroe. Allison Tires, a law professor at DePaul University and visiting professor at Santa Clara University School of Law, said it's been a long-standing practice to sell property to people regardless of their immigration status in the United States. Quote, of course, the Texas legislature might try to pass a law that would ban sales to those without legal status, but it would likely be declared unconstitutional. Bottom line is that states generally have wide latitude to regulate property laws within the state, but those laws cannot violate the Constitution, nor can they interfere or conflict with federal immigration law and policy. She said undocumented people don't need social security numbers to purchase property and can instead get a individual taxpayer identification number, which was created by the IRS in 96 to allow immigrants who don't qualify for a social security number to file their taxes. Now, just, let's take the Republican argument on immigration for a second, right? We know what the background is behind it. We know the reason that they're really worked up about it. But what is like the more old school Republican arguments? Like, well, we don't want people coming into the country who become a drain on our resources because they're utilizing social programs. Right. And so a longstanding demand from the right has been like, well, we want to get these people paying taxes. So all these people who are buying property here are paying taxes. They're paying property taxes to the state of Texas, which, by the way, we don't have income tax in Texas. So that is like the main way that the government here gets money. So all these people are not being a drain on the resources. In fact, they are again, assuming the implication that they're making that these are illegal migrants coming into the country. Well, these are people who are buying into the system. Their money is going into the state coffers. And what are they doing? They're buying a house and building a community. I mean, like at a certain point, it becomes very clear that all of the kind of practical arguments that you get from the Republicans of like, oh, we're just being realist about this kind of thing, they fall away to the wayside here, and it's very much demographic panic about the kinds of people who are living in the state and in this community.
Yeah, I mean, it's
When we
yeah.
look at the numbers of who's living in this community, there's gonna be a special surprise for you, Matt, but we'll get there in a minute.
No, I was just gonna say, like, it is just like I remember in like the 2000s, people saying, by year 2000, we're going to be majority minority, or whatever year it was or is going to be, or whatever. And there's like theoretical, like, ooh, is there going to be a freak out? Like, yes, there was, it's ongoing. It is a fixation among like Republican parties that control like all sorts of states.
And just really fast, the Center Square went and interviewed some people in this community, and I think that this hits very well. This woman who they interviewed is a longtime Houston resident, and moved up to Colony Ridge because I'll quote her saying, "I pay property taxes like everyone else." Sylvia said, "My taxes fund a public school system that my children don't even attend. Having lived in Houston, I can attest to the fact that there are more non-citizens in Houston than in Liberty County, where this is located. There's far more crime in Houston than where I live. I feel safer here than I did in Houston, which is exactly why I left. A greater police presence is needed for a growing community," residents argue. And that is one thing that people in the community have been saying, is that, hey, we need some better funding for police and social services in the area, because that's not happening. Now, I want to get to some of the demographics and things about this, but the right has been fueling this, and this is a real kind of TikTok right-wing media story. And let's just look at some of the investigations that we're getting from some of these brilliant folks on the right looking at this community. This was a TikTok video that was shared by a bunch of very loony right-wing accounts after they went and drove around the community.
You've probably been hearing about Colony Ridge in the news. We're here to actually check it out.
Apparently, this development has been going on for about 10 years of this guy selling land to illegal immigrants.
That doesn't look like a Texas flag or an American flag to me.
About 85% of these structures were not finished. Also, there were stray dogs everywhere. Homes that looked like this really just stretched on for miles and miles and miles. Some houses didn't even have windows. But ironically, many of the houses had fences.
It looks like they're going to put trailers. They're dividing it up into trailer lots. They look like sewage lines starting there, and they're going to run the trailers perpendicular to the road like this.
Okay. So again, if you drive around any part of rural Texas, that's the kind of thing that you're going to be seeing. One, like poverty, unfinished buildings, things like that. So
you take a train in the Northeast, you'll see that. What are you talking about?
I mean, this is some of the most blatant fear mongering and frankly kind of racist, because the implication, again, stuff that I've seen in a long while. But again, it shows how insane and out of touch the vast majority of these kind of far right agitators have gotten. This is some of the most typical stuff in the state of Texas. And look, there's a lot of poverty in the state. And if people are saying, hey, we need to give people good living conditions and things like that, and we need to, take on some of these property developers that are taking advantage of folks, I'm here with you. But again, the thing that they're worked up about is not the fact that there might be predatory loaning going on, but the fact that some people are flying a Mexican flag in their community.
There's a Mexican guy pulling his pants up. Like, come on, Jesus.
So let's just get something right off the top here too about this community, because I can only feel for people who are living in this community now that it's become a bit of a fixation of people on the right, what this means for them. This was a This is a piece. Colony Ridge developers dispute cartel accusations. The development offers direct-to-consumer financing, a ploy often utilized by car dealerships and other large profit projects to cut out pay to a middleman like a bank. However, this sparked rumors that there's no immigration check during the loan process. The president and owner, John Harris, says, "We are all born and raised in the same area from very modest beginnings, with a few of us growing up in trailers. We have lived the American dream and believe hard work and property ownership are key to lifting individuals out of poverty." Don't even need to get into all of that kind of stuff about how they're trying to spin this kind of thing. Well, let's just get two things right here. One, there is no immigration test for any property purchase in not just Texas, in the United States of America. That is not something that you are allowed to screen for. There is, though, a check for associations with terrorist organizations and international criminal narcotic organizations. So all of these people go through that legal process that is the same for every single person. If you are buying a home in Houston, or if you're buying a home in Colony Ridge, right? So this whole implication here is just flat out wrong. That they're sort of skirting the law, and creating this new kind of thing. No, they're not allowed to do that anywhere, right? So again, you're talking about the kinds of people who you are assuming are living here. And again, reminding folks, Texas is a majority minority state. So if you are to drive around most communities in the state of Texas, you're going to have a very diverse membership of folks. But let's just see what the population looks like in this community. In terms of demographics, Liberty County and concerns over a growing number of Hispanic or Latin inhabitants, the U.S. Census Bureau data from 2020 and 2022 shows a trend right on par with the rest of Texas. In 2020, 60% or 66.4% of the population identified as white without any Hispanic or Latin descent, markedly much higher than the state figures, which showed 39.8% were non-Hispanic white people. So in fact, not only is this this community not a mecca of cartel associated individuals, was a disgusting and bald-faced lie. White people are overrepresented in this community by a lot.
And that's why that would explain why there's a little bit more anxiety there if the numbers are still going up. I don't know. Like that's such a that's a surprise. But it also it reminds me of the Great Migration and Black people moving from the South post Jim Crow, and the really extreme reaction from white suburban
But Matt,
areas.
I hear where you're coming from, but let's get something really clear: is that the concerns aren't coming from the community. The
Right.
concerns are coming from the Daily Wire and a bunch of people who are going on tourism now
But why
into the
there?
community to complain. It's because it's a part of a part of the state that has seen a significant increase in population, and there is this kind of different model for how they're selling homes to people, right? That's why it's unique, is because they're using this kind of car loan style housing loan for people. Which again, these people are paying these people are being taken advantage of, frankly. They're paying incredibly high rates of interest on these loans, as we've been hearing multiple reports. Now that people are getting some reporting done on it, people in the community are like, oh wait, is everybody now going to listen to our complaints about the roads and the lack of policing and the public education? No, actually, the reason the Republican Party is not here to help you. They're here to demonize all of y'all. So again, this is one of those things where a lie can get really, really embedded very, very fast. And let's go back to the first person who we talked about, that Fox News clip, fellow from the Center for Immigration Studies organization. If you do the work of actually looking into all of these claims that cartels are behind this community, that this is a community of illegal migrants, people, the implication here too is people are just coming straight from Eagle Pass, to Colony Ridge. Where are these implications coming from? Oh, they're coming from the Center for Immigration Studies, with no backup, no information, no receipts for these kind of claims. And as Matt was saying, this is one of the nastiest organizations in the country, a far right group, which was founded by a fellow named John Tanton. I don't know if you've heard of him before, Matt.
Yeah, big time Nazi, right?
big time racist.
Yeah.
And just to give people a little flavor of what this guy thought about America, he said one time, quote, "I've come to the point of view that for European American society and culture to persist requires a European American majority, and a clear one at that." So all of these organizations, news organizations that are, accepting these claims outright that all this stuff is, happening here. The only justification, or where these claims are all originating from a far right racist institution that has one of their founders being a legitimate race scientist and white nationalist. So this is some truly outlandish stuff. As I said before, too, the claims about there's no immigration checks. This is how you get away with like lies by omission. Well, there's none of that for anybody, anywhere in any part of the country. So that's just false. The claims that the cartel is running this community is false. It comes again from the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a group that has discredited themselves far more times than I feel the need to go into right now. And the only people who are sort of promoting this are far right groups like the Daily Wire, and weird TikTokers putting scary music while they're driving around rural Texas. And if people really do care about the plight of working people in Texas, I'm all here for it. I think we need a lot of development.
Yeah,
And
it's just a little bit suspicious when like the racist guys who are also like okay with economic exploitation are like, hey, look at these Mexicans that are being exploited. It's like, well, maybe they have ulterior motives.
Oh, I mean, and it's super rich for a Republican Party that has made the sanctity of private property, in fact, one of the governing
Right.
platforms of the Texas GOP's platform in this state, saying it's like, well, I feel we're a little bit limited because it's a private property issue. Yeah, exactly. So get the fuck out of there. And we don't need Dan Patrick flying over in a helicopter taking pictures of these folks.
Yeah, as if like you can't just look at what satellite images like. That's very. I mean, it's out of control down there.
It's absolutely out of control. And like, who knows? I mean, like, again, like the fact is like there is no legal way that the GOP can attack these communities. But you know what these kind of things do is they create situations where you get psychos driving into those communities and harassing people. Even driving around and
Right.
filming people's homes, like you just saw right there, is just to a next level kind of thing. And unfortunately, we have seen real vigilante style violence in this state. So when you start creating a story like they are, it's incredibly dangerous that the state's being invaded. There are dangerous people in your community. That's a clear message to some very dangerous people out there. when
I
it
know.
comes to
I mean, I joke, but I actually mean it. Like, whoever's moderating TikTok needs to not allow it to become this sort of like platform of urban surveillance or surveillance of like unwanted communities, because it's so ridiculous the amount of people that don't step foot in a city but like drive through in their car and point their phone out the window at like homeless people or something like that. It's just disgusting. And it's like these platforms can very easily turn, like YouTube early on, the Islamophobia was just like rank. I think maybe it's better now. I feel like maybe that stuff isn't as dumb as it used to be, but like, and that's where we're at with Twitter, is that sort of like pornography of like destitution and under invested in populations, basically.
So, y'all, that's Colony Ridge, the new fixation of the right, and not just the far right. Our governor, our little governor, and the attorney general. So we'll see what happens with any kind of potential special session on that. But now you're at least armed with some information on this. When you see these guys posting things that seem inscrutable, there's really some sinister stuff going on behind the scenes here.
Yeah, a race panic. This is confusing. What is this? Oh yeah, a giant race panic. Great.
Well, folks, we're going to jump over to our interview with Alice Speri, talking about what's been going on in Ukraine. Again, just a heads up, we are going to talk about sexual violence in this clip. We're going to talk about the brutality of the Russian invasion and the horrifying situation that people have found themselves, where they're not only dealing with that, but also dealing with a collaboration law that is being used in a very heavy-handed way. Again, there's a link below for people to read the article. I highly suggest that you do, and we'll be back right after that. Welcome back, everybody. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David.
And we're very honored to be joined today by Alice Speri, who is a reporter with The Intercept. Thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about a story, and just wanted to give everybody a fair warning. We're going to be talking about some sensitive topics, including sexual violence here. But this is a really important story, and I really appreciate your reporting on this. What the story is really getting at is, the effects on everyday people's lives in Ukraine, dealing with both the atrocities from the Russian side and also some of the difficulties when it comes for fighting for justice for people who are living in Ukraine. And maybe to sort of set us up talking about this, in your piece in The Intercept, which we have a link to for people to read, Enemies Within, you profile two people, Anna and Maria. And I was wondering if you could just sort of set the stage for people a little bit, tell people about who they are and what it is that they had experienced.
Of course, yes. So Anna and Maria, first of all, are pseudonyms because they are victims of sexual violence. As this practice, I did not use their real names, but they are a mother and daughter who live just on the outskirts of Bucha, which, people might be familiar as one of the first cities that really kind of became synonymous with like the crimes committed during last year's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Bucha is just on the outskirts of Kiev, and it is a place where we saw massacre take place. Really, it was under Russian occupation for about a month, so a lot less than other parts of the country that have been occupied by Russian forces since then. And when Ukrainian forces retook the city and when journalists started trickling in, they found bodies on the streets. People might remember, seeing the street that leads from Kiev to Bucha lined with corpses. They ultimately found more than 500 people in mass graves, many of them with signs of torture. And as the investigations started, they also found widespread evidence of sexual violence that had happened during the occupation. And so Anna and Maria are two women who stayed in Bucha during the occupation. Most residents fled, but not all. Usually those who stayed behind are, elderly people who didn't really have the ability to move. In fact, the reason why Anna and Maria didn't leave is that Anna's elderly mother is also living with them, and she's basically bedridden and she couldn't really move. They also are very poor and didn't really have anywhere to go, and also no real clear sense of what was happening. So they stayed in Bucha, and they are some of the few who survived the occupation, and as they say in the story, surviving the occupation was immediately seen as suspiciously, because so many people were massacred and tortured during the occupation. Those who didn't, or those who made it out, relatively well, in their case, they went through a horrible experience, but they appear to have survived the occupation okay. Then they were immediately treated with suspicion by their neighbors when they returned. And so, I'm sure people can go into the story. It's quite long and it gets into their ordeal in detail. But just to give you a glimpse of what happened, Anna was threatened by soldiers. She was sexually abused by soldiers. And in order to protect her daughter, who was 13 years old at the time, she essentially made a deal with soldiers and ended up being abused by dozens of them over the month-long occupation of Bucha, in order to protect their daughter. When the occupation ended and her neighbors returned, because they saw her as having somewhat acquiesced to this, Russian threats and having agreed basically to have relationships with Russian soldiers, so she was immediately viewed as a collaborator. And the story really focuses on this idea of collaboration, which is by no means unique to Ukraine. It's something that we see in conflict over and over again. And it's something that, repeatedly, institutionally, we see a failure to address. In Ukraine's case, we had very sweeping legislation that was passed shortly after the invasion that essentially criminalizes almost any contact with the enemy. And so Anna, while a victim of sexual abuse, of, really horrific sexual abuse during the occupation of Bucha, was also treated first by neighbors and then by Ukrainian law enforcement as a suspected collaborator.
Yeah,
And I'm happy to go into more detail, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm trying to be sensitive about it too, because it's incredibly shocking, but people should really read the piece. It's difficult, to read because of subject matter. But this was somebody who was being brutalized by the soldiers. This relationship was punctuated with brutal sexual violence. But also these little details that you noted in the piece is that like they would announce like their presence by firing a gun into the air, or regularly armed and waving around their weapons menacingly against both Anna and Maria. And like and I think it's really notable and important to remember too that there's this very real threat that this person is under the whole time of not just like potentially death to themselves, but also to serious horrific sexual abuse potentially happening to their daughter.
Absolutely. There is no question. This is rape. This is sexual violence. This is a crime under international law. Like that is not the question. But I think what really fascinated me about Maria's story when I heard about it is the fact that all of the neighbors, the law enforcement apparatus in Ukraine, and she herself even didn't really have the terms to describe what had happened. Like they described it as if it had been some kind of consensual relationship, as if you could have consensual relationships in the context of occupation when you're fearing for your 13-year-old daughter. And yet it is precisely what happened, right? There is, I think what's interesting about the story, in addition to the question of collaboration, which we can get into in more depth, is that it really kind of shows, how not there we are when it comes to sexual violence, especially in conflict. We don't have the tools and language to deal with it. And this is not unique to Ukraine, but, sexual violence anywhere, not even just in conflict situations, is substantially underreported, just because there is a tendency to blame victims. And when you add to that kind of like the political, dynamics of collaboration and the context in Ukraine and of like any conflict, that gets muddied even further. And so, we know there was widespread sexual abuse during the invasion. We will never really know the true scale of it. And one of the reasons why I was, put onto the story in the first place is that I was hearing over and over from human rights attorneys that I've been speaking to over the last couple of years that, not enough women are coming forward, and not just women, there have been men, but it's, majority of women. Not enough women are coming forward because they fear the stigma that's associated to sexual violence in society in general. And then on top of it, this fear of being labeled a traitor, essentially.
Yeah. So, maybe let's start before we get into like the collaboration law and all that. Could you we've established, the trauma and the pain that's going on like during the actual occupation. But then as people, as the area is liberated and people are returning, could you talk about how Anna and Maria were treated by their neighbors? Because, that's another pretty brutal part of the story as well.
Yes. And I think that's also something that's quite interesting, because as media, we tend to be so focused on kind of the moment of conflict and the moment of the occupation, the moment the crimes were committed. And we don't pay as much attention to kind of like the ripple effects and after effects that linger on and sort of the societal divisions they create. So basically what happened is, about a month after Bucha was occupied, it was retaken by Ukrainian forces, and slowly neighbors started trickling in. And including some who had horrific experiences themselves. One of Anna's neighbors, she was actually photographed by an Associated Press photographer the day that the city was liberated, as she walked into her yard, and as she found her husband and two other relatives executed on the ground. And there are stories like this in Bucha, everywhere you turn. As I mentioned earlier, there were mass graves that were uncovered, and as people started returning, they found more and more bodies, more evidence that people had been abused before they were killed. And in all of this, you have you have Anna and Maria who had survived the occupation because they had because Anna had basically made this deal with soldiers. They were fed, and they didn't look as if they had gone through the sort of trauma that some of the other neighbors had gone through, although we know from them that their experience had been just as horrific. And that was immediately a cause of suspicion. There was also a lot of looting that took place in Bucha, as happens in conflict everywhere. And so they were accused of having looted from neighbors' homes. Many of the residents who stayed faced similar accusations. And so basically really what we saw everywhere in Ukraine, as territories were liberated, we saw neighbors kind of turning on each other and pointing fingers at each other and asking questions about those who stayed. And those who stayed have a lot of resentment towards those who left because they felt abandoned, and they have a lot of resentment toward Ukrainian authorities because they felt like they were not really given tools to kind of survive. They're not really sure how it is that you're supposed to behave under occupation in order to not be considered a traitor and also to survive. And that really gets to the question of like collaboration of, it doesn't really take into consideration the circumstances of life under occupation. And so that, over time, that kind of grew into further conflict. And in Anna's case, I mean, she was already somewhat ostracized in Bucha. She was, a widow. She's quite poor, as I mentioned. She's like a rather eccentric person, and she had like, a bit of a reputation before the occupation, and after the occupation that just escalated to, neighbors pointing fingers at her and accusing her of having fed intelligence to Russian soldiers. So like not just of having looted, but also having given soldiers information about, neighbors who ended up being killed. And all of this without evidence, right? We have no idea what actually happened. And but that really kind of points to some of the the fissures that we're seeing. And I told this story, but this same scenario is playing out over and over again in every liberated town and village. And what the story is hoping to get at is the fact that while some of this is, I guess, normal in society, like that's where you need government institutions to step in and sort of have a policy and have kind of like a vision of how to deal with these divisions in society. And instead, what happened in Ukraine is really the criminalization of any kind of contact with Russians, which, has led to thousands of Ukrainian citizens being prosecuted. And so not only you have the neighbors pointing fingers, you now have actual criminal cases against many of these people. Some founded, there absolutely is real collaboration that took place. And then some that are just based on suspicions and gossip and, rumors.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the collaboration law a little bit here. If you could sort of take people through how that came into being in the first place, because I remember in your piece, you noting that there were attempts to put these things forward maybe in 2014. So if you could talk a little bit about how it was established, and also I think one thing that's really important that you noted in your piece too, and you were just saying as well, is like it's a massive scope of people who can get wrapped up in this, from things, as you were saying, it's like, that are like, you can prove like, hey, here's collaboration, to things that, are very minuscule if you were to, consider the fact of this massive war going on, coming after some of the people that they're coming after. It seems a little over the top.
Yeah. So, the first calls for the legislation were really came on the heels of the 2014 Donbass conflict, when we had, Ukrainian separatists that were backed by Russian troops that basically seized control of, large sections of the country and that have been under occupation since then, Crimea, then Donetsk and Luhansk. And those are territories that Russia like unilaterally annexed also during last year's invasion. And so at that time, when Ukrainian forces were able to regain control of some of the territories, there was a lot of demand from local residents to punish those locals who had contributed to the separatist effort. Particularly at that point, the focus was on elected officials. So initially, the law was aimed at, politicians, municipal workers, mayors, people that were in positions of authority who helped or were, believed to have helped the separatist effort. At that time, there wasn't really a political desire to pass this legislation. There were a lot of questions about it. I think people recognized that there are real divisions in Ukrainian society, and that's actually something else the story tries to get at. It's, since last year's invasion, the Ukrainian government has been very good at projecting this sense of like national unity that's absolutely there in a sense, like the country is very much unified in response to the Russian invasion. But it is also true that there are Ukrainians that have been pro-Russian in some way or the other. There are Ukrainians that welcomed the separatist effort back in 2014. And there are even some Ukrainians who initially welcomed the invasion last year. And I think it does nobody any good to kind of pretend as if those differences are not there. That doesn't take away the fact that this was an invasion. There's no question about that. But I think, kind of glossing over the differences that exist in society is ultimately going to do more harm than good. And so I think legislators back in 2014 recognized that. There also were already a lot of other laws on the books that could have been used to go after some of these people. There was already a treason law and other, articles of the criminal code. And so there were several proposals, but the law was never really taken up to a vote. Then in February 2022, when the invasion, the full-scale invasion started, within days, Zelensky's party reintroduced the law. And this time it was passed really quickly with basically no debate. And it was a version of the law that was much broader than the initial proposal that had really called only for civil penalties, primarily for elected officials and municipal workers. And so, it was calling for bans from public office and things like this. Instead, the version of the law that ended up passing is quite sweeping. It prohibits a really broad range of behavior from, participating in some of these elections that hold quotation marks elections that Russian authorities are holding in occupied territory. It also applies to pretty much any, municipal worker or jail staff. Actually, is certainly some of the ones that have been prosecuted most. Police that continue to report to work under the occupation authorities, and also it applies to a lot of teachers and school administrators that continue to report to work under occupation authorities and therefore taught what is considered under law to be, well, not just what is considered under law, what is effectively Russian propaganda, and that is another subsection of the law. So a lot of the people that have been prosecuted are actually people that, worked in schools under the Russian authorities. And then it also, it criminalizes basically the public denial by any Ukrainian citizen of the fact that this is an invasion and there is a war of aggression against Ukraine. And that can be really anything. That's essentially somebody going online and posting their opinion. And we have seen a lot of those prosecutions. And, a lot of these are relatively minor sentences, but we've seen also, major prison sentences. And then, as we mentioned earlier, there is, of course, a real collaboration that does happen. There is real feeding of intelligence to the Russian military. We've seen that lead to attacks on civilians. So, this is not to deny that the collaboration happens and should be criminalized to a certain extent. But the law that ended up passing really could apply to tens of thousands of Ukrainians. I mean, it applies to, people in villages that are selling food to soldiers. It could apply to potentially anyone that's lived under occupation for the last decade. I mean, anybody in Crimea. Some of the people who've been more outspoken about this are representatives of Ukrainians in Crimea and people that have been under occupation for so long that inevitably they've collaborated with the enemy in some way. So that's kind of the legislation in a nutshell. The other thing that I think is really interesting is because I focus a lot on international law, and Ukraine has really made a push. The Ukrainian government has made a push to really, they have the ICC investigation underway. They're working with all kinds of international experts in prosecuting some of these tens of thousands of crimes that they're investigating. And so they're really sort of looking to live up to international standards when it comes to accountability. But even international law actually has a bit of a blind spot when it comes to collaboration. No country has quite done. I mean, you can think about examples of collaboration, after World War II in France. You can think about accusations of collaboration in Northern Ireland, in Palestine. This is something that happens everywhere. And more often than not, the response is kind of like a vigilante, sort of mass execution of anybody that's suspected of being a collaborator. It's rare you see, a proper legal process, and Ukrainian authorities are at least attempting that, if on a scale that I think is absolutely out of proportion. But basically the law, it's there's no real solution, because under international law, the occupying authority has an obligation to provide services to civilians, to keep schools running, to keep policing, to keep society running, and they're allowed to recruit locals to do that. They can't coerce them, but of course, under occupation, what's coercion? Is it having a gun pointed to your head? Is it not having a salary? Is it just fear? I mean, it's very difficult to come to discern motives in a situation like that. And then on the other hand, the occupied country has a right to prosecute people who have, aided the occupation. And so there's really no solution. And I think Ukraine is kind of like a test, the fact that there is so much international attention put into accountability measures there. It is a good opportunity to talk about how do we deal with this issue that pops up with every single conflict.
Yeah, it just seems counterproductive from not only from the perspective of, investigating sexual violence, but just from your piece ends with the ambivalence of yes, I didn't like the invaders, the Russians, but I'm also not very happy with the Ukrainians and how they've investigated that. Just doesn't seem like a smart and making it petty like that, it seems counterproductive to me.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think it's, on the one hand, I think that the massive investment in accountability that Ukrainian government has, set up, that's hugely important. We know that the lack of accountability for Russian crimes in other conflicts, Syria, for example, is directly led to the crimes that we saw then repeated. The attacks on civilians that happened in Syria were not prosecuted, and then that directly led to impunity, and that led to some of the crimes we saw in Ukraine. So on the one hand, prosecutions are hugely important, even though a majority of the Russian soldiers who are being prosecuted right now are being prosecuted in absentia, and a lot of the higher level collaborators, the ones that actually really did contribute to the Russian military, to the occupation, a lot of them fled. So a lot of the kind of like senior people are being prosecuted in absentia. But even so, the investment in these trials is hugely important. Like, I think, this is not to discount, this effort at accountability. It is a very important that's happening in Ukraine. On the other hand, I think we've maybe put too much, even international community has put too much emphasis on that and hasn't really looked at any kind of transitional justice type mechanisms for Ukraine. And, what Ukrainians will tell you is like the war is still going on, and until that's over, we can't really talk about transitional justice. And that makes sense. But what we're talking about here is not so much like the diplomatic effort to end the conflict, which is, a whole separate conversation, but even just simply within Ukrainian society. Like, how do we deal with, there's a Ministry of Reintegration, but they haven't really tackled some of these issues. And as I said before, a lot of these conflicts, predate the invasion by a long time. So it's not a new problem. It's just something that's never quite been dealt with. And I don't think it's going to get any better. And I think especially as we see the conflicts drag on, there should be policies in place for those territories that have been liberated, because this is happening everywhere that's been liberated.
Well, I mean, to take it back to Anna and Maria for a second, could you talk about, their experience now with this collaboration law, and also the initial fight that they had for these things to be recognized in the first place as war crimes and crimes of sexual violence against them?
And maybe the prosecutor, Roman Pishik, too, as well.
Yeah, so so basically, once Bucha was liberated, neighbors had already become suspicious of Anna and Maria, because there had been all these social media posts during the occupation that were saying that they were hanging out with Russian soldiers. They had Russian soldiers in their yard all the time. They had accused them of looting. So when neighbors returned, they reported her to police. And first, local police turned up and really treated them with a lot of suspicions up front. They saw that they had paint canisters in their garage, and said that that's what the Russians used to bark the homes of allies. Like they really immediately kind of like dismissed their claims. And Anna was very, very open with both law enforcement and her neighbors about what happened, including the sexual violence. And nobody really seemed to take her seriously. There's certainly this element of, you're just like not taking her seriously, not believing her, which is something that, victims of sexual violence face all the time. And in her case, it was kind of like compounded by the fact that there were these other suspicions about her. So she reported what had happened to her to local police. There was an investigation opened by a local prosecutor who took Anna to a medical exam where, she described this horrible scene of being in a waiting room, seeing all these elderly women waiting for a medical exam as well, because those were, most of the women who stayed behind were women who couldn't leave. And so, she had done what she had done to protect her daughter, who was 13, but then she realized then that she probably in the process had protected her mother as well, who was 74. And then after that, she never really heard anything about her sexual violence case. Like, she reported a sexual violence from the start. But instead, what ended up happening is she was seen as, first a suspected looter and then a suspected collaborator. So she had a string of law enforcement officers, at first local, then national police, then national intelligence, come over to her house, search her house without really explaining what they were doing. Her daughter was treated, pretty roughly by police. She was handcuffed at some point. They took all the family's phones away. So it was very clear that they were being investigated as opposed to treated like the victims they are. And this is for, the first several months after Bucha was liberated. And up until late summer, fall 2022. So Bucha was liberated in early April. So for months, she was treated like this by police. And then the Ukrainian Office of the Prosecutor General opened a special conflict-related sexual violence unit under its war crime division. So several months in, as the Ukrainian government kind of built up this apparatus to deal with the massive amount of crimes it was facing, they have more than 80,000 investigations open. They kind of started build up expertise, build up teams of people that could deal with this. And so the Office for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence was taken over by a female prosecutor who a lot of international experts came in, and there was a little bit of a reckoning that, up until that moment, Ukrainian law enforcement have really failed victims. And so there's been retraining underway. There are some pilot programs in Kharkiv and in Kherson, which have, also been liberated. And so there's definitely a recognition that there was a problem, and there's some early effort to do something about it. It's a long road. I mean, you don't easily kind of change the culture, not just of, multiple law enforcement agencies, but also of like an entire country, right? And so that's, slowly that's been happening. So at the same time, for instance, the SBU, Ukraine's intelligence agency, recognized, Anna as a victim of violence, gave her documentation that gives her victim status. At the same time, they took her to a polygraph exam where they asked questions both about the sexual violence she faced and also about what kind of collaboration, or what kind of information she might have exchanged with Russians. So it's never really clear. Are they treating her as a victim? Are they treating her as a collaborator? Is it both? And really the story kind of makes the point that the authorities really had no system in place to deal with this. And so what we know now is not much because, there's no official charges were ever filed against her that she knows of. A lot of the collaboration charges are, national security related. So there's they're not kind of disclosed even to her attorneys. But her attorney doesn't believe that the collaboration case against her is ongoing if it was ever formally launched. There is a sexual violence case. She is a witness, a victim and witness to war crimes. So she's been called into Kyiv multiple times to identify soldiers. But at this point, it's been, almost 2 years. She has stayed in Bucha. She, neighbors despise her. She is completely, she's been completely isolated. She's also come under attack. She's had her fence vandalized. She's had her windows broken. Maria's been attacked by neighbors. And, it's interesting because one of the people I interviewed about the origins of the legislation said that, there is a need for a legislation on collaboration because if you don't have the government intervene to address an issue that is real, then what happens is people take it in their own hands. And we'll definitely see that happening, whether or not, their suspicions about their neighbors are founded. So we're definitely seeing a lot of vigilante type, responses to this issue. Neighbors don't believe that she's a victim. They don't believe, they basically believe she's making it up and she got away with it. And so, police may not be, prosecutors may not be going forward with a collaboration case against her as far as we know, but she's basically been judged by her neighbors already. So, from her perspective, and, she has this very striking quote that I include in the story, pretty much every Ukrainian I have talked to refers to Russian soldiers as the orcs, these fairy tale monsters. And so does Anna, of course, because she's had this horrible experience with them. But at the same time, she said, sometimes like Ukrainian police behave like orcs themselves. And, she talks about this horrific ordeal she went through during the occupation and says that wasn't even the worst of it. So it really, the occupation of Bucha has ended, but things haven't really ended for her.
I mean, in closing, I mean, I know we've sort of been talking around it, but in terms of building out any kind of solution or movement around this, I mean, what are people in the human rights world saying? What are legal experts sort of saying that can sort of be done about? I mean, it just seems really difficult to get your head around.
It's extremely difficult, and it's not just kind of coming up with solutions, but also just talking about it. One of the things that drew me to this story in the first place is that I kept hearing from human rights advocates, Ukrainian and international groups also that are based there, that this is kind of like one of their primary concerns, and yet that they don't feel that there is a political space to talk about this. So there are a few organizations that have called for amendments to the legislation, for instance, to kind of rein it in a little bit and like only focus on major crimes. And instead, there are proposals to make it even harsher. So, right now, like Ukrainian authorities are not really anywhere closer to kind of reforming this law. But there are also international organizations that have been very guarded about what they say about this, like very quietly telling you that this is a problem, but not really taking it up with Ukrainian authorities. And I think this is part of a broader trend we're seeing with the war, which, there's this like hesitation on part of everybody that's working in Ukraine or covering Ukraine even to be critical about, the way Ukrainian government is handling various things, which is not the same thing as dismissing the reality of the invasion. And I think people have kind of been so fearful and I've written other stories earlier this year, for instance, about Ukrainian authorities really tightening media access. It's of course, not comparable to Russia, where you have, an American journalist in prison as we speak. But Ukrainian authorities have very, very much sought to control the narrative that comes out of the conflict. And so in a way, we've seen a ton of coverage of Ukraine, but we've seen a lot that doesn't get written about. And this issue of collaboration is something that, you're seeing some stories here and there, but it's not kind of reported on to the extent that it is it's happening. But yeah, in terms of solutions, I mean, I think it goes back to the fact that there has to be some kind of transitional justice plan for Ukraine at some point. And, of course, the conflict is not over, but there are many, many people like Anna and Maria who are now kind of trying to figure out, where they stand on this. And the other thing is there's been a lot of confusion around collaboration. Like we've had, for instance, Russian authorities have been issuing passports to people that live in occupied territory, and you've had some Ukrainian officials telling people, do what you need to do to survive. If that means taking a Russian passport, take a Russian passport. You just gotta hang in there until, we can come and liberate you. And then you've had other Ukrainian officials saying that is treason and you should absolutely not take a Russian passport. So like that kind of shows you some of the contradiction. There's no clear message. And I think part of the problem is that, when you look at collaboration, it's like people, I guess like the standard that's been set is like, the bravest resistance is the only acceptable the only acceptable response to the occupation. So anything short of full-on resistance is treason. And that's just not how life works. I mean, people still have to feed their kids. People can be scared. Some people, there's all kinds of reasons why people may end up collaborating. And I think we need a more kind of like holistic approach to how to deal with them.
Yeah. You should want people to live to, help rebuild, whenever we get to the end of this. And I do think like what I kept thinking about reading the story is like how when we hear about war, whether it's this invasion or, invasion of Iraq, rape is a huge part of that. Like, and I don't think, like you said, with the political space, like I think we just need to have a broader understanding as people who oppose the use of military force that like this is actually part of those sorts of operations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the war in Ukraine, if anything, has kind of brought attention to issues that we've seen play out in conflicts over and over and over again with very little attention. And we're just starting to kind of, even as like, the community of like international law experts I talk to all the time, like, there's just like, this happens over and over and over again, and we don't have processes in place for how to deal with it. And so, I mean, to me, that's why it was important to tell this story. Also, I think this story was important to me because it kind of shows, how everyone loses in war always. How, you have neighbors that turn on each other, and neighbors who went through horrific experiences turn on other neighbors who also went through horrific experiences. And we don't really spend enough time kind of talking about the aftermaths of conflict. Like we just move on from conflict really quickly. And of course, the conflict is ongoing in Ukraine. There's plenty to report on the front lines, although, there are access issues there. But we don't really look at what happens to society afterwards. And I think that kind of, it's not like it sanitizes war, but it just like, people don't understand kind of like the full scope of what war does to society, even within like a village, basically like this, neighborhood outside of Bucha. It's, so I think, I mean, it's a very tragic story, as like any story that comes out of war. But what kind of fascinated me about it is sort of all the layers and the complexities of it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, well, people really should read this piece. It's in the Intercept, Enemies Within. We have a link below for people to go and check it out. Alice Speri, thank you so much for joining us today on Left Reckoning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, folks, really appreciate her taking the time, and I do highly suggest y'all reading that piece. It's very well reported and comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really kind of traumatizing piece. There's a lot of detail in there. It's very well reported, and I mean, to go on a micro level, and then kind of show how war conditions are. This is what they beget. And so that's a condemnation of the invasion itself, and any kind of idea that this sort of condition should be lengthened out beyond longer than necessary.
No, absolutely, man. Well, folks, we're going to jump over to the post game patreon.com/left reckoning. We'll be taking some questions and calls from all of y'all. We got a couple things we'll be chatting about as well. Just a reminder that one, if you're only getting the main show, you're missing out on almost double the content, triple the content. We've got our bonus episodes on Sunday and the post game immediately after these shows. And supporting this program really helps us be able to have these kind of conversations and jump into a lot of these things. It's not just all kind of commentary and reacting to the news cycle like we see in a lot of other places. So we're gonna be over there, patreon.com/left reckoning. Please come and join us if you haven't come over to the other side before. We'll be over there in just a couple minutes, folks.
See ya.